Welcome to the Apostrophe. My name is Matt Quantz, and I'll be walking you through our lesson this week about the apostrophe. The first thing I'd like to mention is that all of the resources that I used for this were taken from a writer's reference by Diana Hacker and Nancy Summers, the 8th edition. Anything written is from that book. I did try to change many of the examples to make it a little bit more my own, but most things that you see will be from that book. So first we want to talk about using an apostrophe to indicate that a noun is possessive. And there are 5 great examples of when to do that. First is when you would add an apostrophe S. Typically, possessive nouns indicate ownership. So some examples of when you would add an apostrophe S might be a man's bag, and it would be M-A-N apostrophe S. Or Matt's house, and again, it would be apostrophe S. There's times you also want to add an apostrophe after the S. Some of those examples might be if a noun is plural and ends in an S naturally. So some examples of that might be 2 actresses' movies are ... In that case, actresses, I would put the apostrophe after the S. Another example of when a noun is possessive would be joint possession. And you would use apostrophe S with the last noun only. So an example of that might be, have you been inside Matt and Monica's new home? Because there was joint possession of Matt and Monica's, I would do apostrophe S after Monica's. Another example would be compound nouns. If a noun is compound, you would use apostrophe S. A good example of compounds, and this is also found in the book, has to do with words like mother-in-law, father-in-law, etc. So an example might be, my sister-in-law's new car is fast. After sister-in-law's, it would be apostrophe S. Finally, there are indefinite pronouns. Indefinite pronouns refer to no specific person or thing. Words such as everyone, someone, no one, something, etc. So an example of an indefinite pronoun might be, no one's car is as fast as Jenny's. The no ones, I would have apostrophe S. Next, we'll move on to using an apostrophe to mark omissions in contractions and numbers. In a contraction, the apostrophe takes the place of one or more missing letters. A common contraction is its, which is IT apostrophe S, and that stands for it is. An example of a contraction would be, we should have worn a jacket today. In this case, should have would have an apostrophe after the D and before the VE, because that stands for should have. Another example of when you would use an apostrophe to mark an omission would be to indicate the first 2 letters of a year, or 2 numbers of a year. So for instance, I graduated high school in the 90s. I would have apostrophe 90 instead of saying 1990s. We don't want to use an apostrophe in these situations. 1, the plural of numbers. Don't use an apostrophe in the plural of any numbers. An example might be, the 1980s are known for their big hair bands. In this case, you would not put an apostrophe after the 80 in the 1980s. You also generally don't want to have an apostrophe after the plural of letters. There are some exceptions which makes this confusing, but I'm going to speak to the general rule. So in this case, you generally wouldn't want to put an apostrophe after letter. So for instance, I might say, I received 2 B's on my last couple of assignments. After the 2 B's, I would not put an apostrophe in that scenario. Another would be a plural of an abbreviation. Now the book has a couple of examples of DVDs or PhDs. I know that was a learning for me. But an example that I came up with is I had to go see 2 different doctors. Now, doctors in this case, I put DRS because it is a abbreviation. So you would not put an apostrophe after an abbreviation. Finally, you would not have an apostrophe with plural of words mentioned as words. So for instance, she tried out for many roles and received a lot of no's. So I would not put an apostrophe after no's. There are finally are common misuses of the apostrophe. We don't want to use an apostrophe with nouns that are not possessive or possessive pronouns. A very common example of this is its. There are times its means its. There are other times with an apostrophe it means it is. But the common words that cause problems or misuses with the apostrophe are its, whose, his, hers, ours, yours, and theirs. So for instance, an example may be, many doctors attend school well into their 30s. In this case, you would not put an apostrophe before the S because it's not a possessive. There are many other places that you can misuse an apostrophe, but those words are the most common. Thank you for your time today, and I hope that you enjoyed and learned something from the lesson on apostrophes.